Hello, this evening's message is something that I'm probably going to entitle the sixth language factor, although I thought maybe the sixth language threshold or the sixth language milestone or maybe even the sixth language law or rule would be good, but those last two are probably going too far. This all stems back to a set of observations that I made about the relationship between multilingualism and polyglottery about 15 years ago, and I wrote up my reflections on this in an article that I published, well, not published, but put on the forum of how to learn any languages. And this article had got a lot of traction then, and it's been put on other discussion circles and the like, and comes back to me often. Throughout the years, people come up to me and say, hey, do you still really believe that everybody should learn these six languages? And people rattle off a list of things that I might have suggested. And so it's gotten kind of generalized and perhaps a bit distorted in the telling. So I'd like to go back and retell it, revisit the main idea, and add to it the perspective that I've gained from another 15 or 20 years of language learning and language loving. So where does this all stem from? It stems from my reflections upon the fact that I think that multilingualism is really a reason for or justification for, if not polyglottery, at least learning languages. For those who are unfamiliar, I make a distinction. Multilingualism is knowing various languages because you grow up with them, you acquire them from the environment in which you're young and you become mature, whereas polyglottery is when you learn multiple languages of your own choosing, when you are already an adult or a young adult. And in thinking about this, I was thinking about the fact that for multilingualism, we have terms like bilingual and trilingual that are dictionary words. You can look them up and find them and see what they mean. But quadrilingual and quinilingual, sexalingual, septilingual, octolingual, nonalingual, these are not dictionary terms. So we kind of, in general, are like the sort of mythical people who count 1, 2, 3, and then many. But there are quadrilingual people and quinilingual people in this world. And just thinking about that, I was thinking about the fact that there are, particularly in places like Africa, maybe in Nigeria, a big city like Lagos, or in South Africa, a city like Johannesburg in particular, or in India or Indonesia, there are sections of the world where you can find cities where 10 or 12 languages are in active use. But you don't find people who speak 10 or 12 languages in these places. There are places in the world, definitely, where we have the words, again, bilingual and trilingual. Many places where you have bilingual and trilingual people. In countries in Europe, Luxembourg, and places like this, you find the majority of the population might know 4 languages, be quadrilingual. But what about these places like Johannesburg and Lagos? You don't get people who know 10 or 12 languages, but you can find where you might say it's not rare that people know 5 or 6 different languages. And that got me thinking that if anybody, because in environments like that, anybody who grows up there knows this many languages, that kind of means that our brains are designed to be able to do that. And it might be said that it might be our birthright or our heritage to be multilingual. And in point of fact, it is, I think, established that it is more common for societies to be, to some degree, multilingual than monolingual. And so monolingual people from monolingual societies, like I myself, people who grow up only speaking one language, knowing one language like English, might be said to be kind of a handicap in a way, because knowing multiple languages is clearly advantageous. It gives you different perspectives, gives you different abilities, gives you the ability to communicate with people from different areas. So if it is our natural, normal birthright to be multilingual and we grow up not multilingual, then we've kind of been robbed of something. And what have we been robbed of? Well, not just being bilingual or trilingual, but again, if a society has 10 or 12 languages in it, people don't grow up picking them all up, but they do in my estimation, my knowledge, my conversations with people from these areas, find that it's not uncommon to find people from Nigeria or South Africa or India who somewhat naturally know 5 or 6 different languages, a handful plus of languages. So that was my first reflections, that is kind of a natural birthright. And if that is something that our brains are designed to be capable of doing, if they're not doing that, then they're kind of being robbed or deprived of something that perhaps they should be doing. And so I thought that perhaps people with a certain intellectual turn of mind might find that interesting as sort of a lifetime's challenge to say, well, if my environmental circumstances did not give me all of these 5 or 6 languages, perhaps I can provide them to myself to do what my brain is clearly designed to be capable of doing, because anybody, people not of high education or not of high intelligence, anybody who grows up in that environment picks these languages up. So that was my first train of thought back when I was first cogitating these matters. And then I started thinking about, wow, that number, 5 or 6, it's a handful. I say a handful plus. It might be 5, it might be 6, it might be 7, depending on how you count. Do you include your native language? Do you not include it? When you talk about different languages, are you talking about languages that are all from different families or different areas? So I would say in this factor or threshold or milestone, it's not a cut and dry 6 number, but it is a handful plus. So I also got thinking about this handful or handful plus languages. Does this represent anything else? And I thought, well, in my own experience, it certainly did. The first 6 languages I learned were French, German, Spanish, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. And with all of those, I wouldn't say that I necessarily struggled, but I remember having really major intellectual blocks. What? The verb goes here? And how do you put the verb at the end of a sentence? How do you wait for that? Sanskrit in particular, sandhi, all these different laws of mutations. The first 5 or 6 languages that I learned, I kind of faced the possibility of defeat or failure. And think about it, when people set out to learn languages, there's no guarantee of success. Most people do quit before they get to any high degree of ability. So there are various ways that you can fail in learning a language. If you're doing it in school, you can take a test and get lots of red ink on your paper, get it back and not pass the grade. You can just feel like you're treading water forever and not making progress and so stop, or you can get discouraged and give up. And so in my experience, the first 5 or 6 languages that I learned did present sort of cognitive challenges. It was like really major blocks in comprehending the way that one would process the information. But after that, I just didn't face that. After that, even with really difficult languages like Korean or Arabic, there was no question that I could do it if I put in the time. And so that kind of got me thinking, I don't know, back to the period of World War I, fighter aces, flyers, who would get up in these really primitive aircraft and go with machine guns and shoot at other guys in primitive aircrafts. And there was just this experience that people made back then that, the first 5 times you went up and got in combat, aerial combat, you were much more likely to be shot down than you were to shoot the other guy down. But after you shot 5 other guys down, you were much more likely to shoot more guys down than to be shot down. So you were called an ace. There was sort of a threshold that you crossed, a milestone that you passed in which you knew what you were doing. There's no guarantee that you would never be shot down. Many people were shot down after that, but just the chances are much higher. And I kind of feel the same thing. The cognitive difficulty in processing the different ways that languages work kind of goes away with experience. After you have learned or taught yourself 5 or 6 different languages, you're not likely to fail in that endeavor. You know the terrain. So that was another way that I thought that 5 or 6 or 7, or again, depending on how you count them, a handful plus of languages represented some sort of a factor in your development as a language learner. And so at that point, I sort of thought, well, okay, anybody who is interested in that might want to sort of systematically develop a way of approaching languages, approaching language learning. And so I thought, okay, this is not for everybody. Again, I never said everybody under the sun should learn languages. I'm definitely in favor of offering the widest variety of language opportunities in any educational system, but I do think that people need to want to learn languages in order to succeed in them. So I'm not in favor of saying everybody should learn languages. I think it would be a very boring world if all everybody did was learn languages. There's many other things that you can be fascinated with and give your passion and time to. But for people who are interested in learning languages, or for people who would accept what I kind of posited before, that it is our sort of mental, intellectual birthright. With our brains, we're designed to be able to process and function in different languages, to seek after a variety of knowledge, a variety of different languages. And so at that point I posited that maybe one might want to systematically develop knowledge in a number of different categories. And I think I threw out about 4. I said, well, if you want to systematically really develop the widest range, you might want to look at learning the classical languages of your civilization. You might want to look at learning the other major languages of your cultural environment. You might want to look at learning an international language, a world language, so you communicate with lots of people. And you might want to look at learning something else, something exotic, something different. And so these categories can overlap. Some things can be in one and can be in the other. Now, when I rethink this, I would say, well, we might add a 5th category. You might want to add a language that is somehow a heritage language to you, or historically related to the language that you speak. But I would never say that there's any set languages that somebody should learn. If you are at all interested in having a systematic outline of a life learning path of languages, you're welcome to write to me. You're welcome to look on my website. I have in my question and answer section already a lot of people asking for a systematic approach to language learning, because I do think there is one. If you tell me your background and your interests and where you come from, and the language that you think you might want to learn, I can recommend a course of action, a course of procedure that would be more efficacious than just sort of going at it haphazard. But these languages, again, they're not set, and they are things that we need to keep in mind when we approach language learning in this regard. And again, if we go back to that preliminary example of the multilingual people from, say, big cities in Africa, and we look at them and we say, well, okay, somebody who happens to grow up in Johannesburg or Lagos might grow up knowing 5 or 6 different languages. But does this mean that they know all of them to the same degree? They know all of them perfectly? They all know them equally well? Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, that would be really the exception. You're going to find that they know maybe 1 or 2 of them as school languages in which they're perfectly literate and in which they've been educated. Maybe another 1 or 2 might be tribal languages of their family, so that they speak them really well. Others might be really circumstantial. This might be, a language of commerce. In the marketplace, you use this to bargain and buy and sell things. Another language might be a language of religious worship. So this is something that they know text in and can pray in, but not outside of that realm. Other languages they might be sort of fossilized in. They might have good pronunciation and basic grammatical knowledge, but not advanced adult literary skills. And I think the same thing is true when we, as polyglots, try to learn lots of languages. It would be really nice if we could perhaps wave a magic wand and be perfectly fluent in all the languages that we know, but without magic wands, that's not going to happen. And when we set out to learn lots of languages, we got to keep that in mind, that it's not necessary, absolutely, to know them to perfection. And I do think that there is out there sort of a spirit of perfectionism that says, it's not worthwhile learning a language unless you know it perfectly. It's not worthwhile learning a language unless you, master it and are totally fluent in it. And that might be the case if you are offering your skills as a professional simultaneous interpreter, or if you're a spy in wartime, you definitely need to pass as a native. But in other cases, there are degrees to which you can learn languages and profit from them and know them and enjoy knowing them and get a lot out of knowing them. So going back to that article that I wrote, say 15 years ago, the suggestions that I made, for example, for a native English speaker, if I go to that category of languages that are the classical languages of your civilization, that would be Latin and Greek, obviously, that are not just offer great text to read, but are also the etymological source rivers of all the other languages you might learn. Then when I said the other major languages of the civilization, that might be French and German and Spanish or Russian, could all fall under this category. When I talked about a world language, that might, include languages that are spoken by millions and billions of people, like Chinese and Hindi, or that are widely spoken in other realms, like, again, Spanish, if it didn't get included in the prior category, or Russian or other languages. Something exotic could be whatever caught your fancy. I think back then I was thinking that it would be nice if everybody learned something that was rare or endangered or being revived, or something else. Something that is your heritage language to depend on you. If you have Polish ancestry, but you've lost total contact with it, it might be Polish. Historically, if you're interested in historical comparative linguistics, if you are a native English speaker, it might be Middle, Ancient, or Old English. So, but there's no set list that I would have of that anybody out there should learn, definitely. So I'd like to dispel that idea once and for all that I said everybody should learn these 6 languages. Thinking more about, again, this number 6, and it not being an absolute number 6. Again, some people count 5, your native language, and then 5 others. Some people would say, well, it depends if I'm learning all languages that are related from one language family, is a much less somehow difficult task than learning lots of different unrelated languages. So it's a handful plus. It's not a set number. But within that regards too, as I mentioned, with 15 or 20 more years of perspective on this topic, I would say that I have this to add to what I wrote back then, that I do think that same number, a handful plus, 6 however you count it, also represents a factor or a milestone or a threshold in several other regards. And one of those is the number of languages that is somehow reasonable to aspire to learn if you are not going to be totally obsessed with language learning for your whole life. If you're going to say, can I find a way to actually integrate knowing and using multiple languages in my life without going out of my way to develop a system to practice and to use languages as such, that is a more manageable factor than what many of us in the polyglot community go out and learn dozens of different languages. And likewise, I would say that really thinking about the question of how many languages can you take and develop to a high level, to a level of really being able to pick up a novel that's written in them and just sit down and read it and enjoy it, and maintain that level and use that level. 6-ish is about the same number that you would be able to do that in, to maintain that in. So somehow it does seem like this rough number of 6 is a factor that's been almost designed, programmed into our brains to be something that we can learn from the environment if we get it. That if we teach it to ourselves, then does represent something that, should we want to go on and teach ourselves or learn more languages, represents kind of a threshold after which it's not difficult, it's not so much an intellectual challenge, but just a question of time. It also represents what we can sort of balance in a balanced life, and represents sort of the number of languages that we can, at any one given time, sort of sit down and enjoy and use profitably. So that's an update of my ideas that I first articulated some years ago, and a clarification, and I hope it was interesting and useful to you, and if so, I will talk to you again next week.